This is definitely going to be the spiciest video I've ever made. And before you guys go in the comments and start telling me that child murder is bad and that, you know, comparing me to Hitler, just hear me out, okay? Throughout all of New Vegas, we hear the con side of the story. And the con side of the story is obviously heavily biased for them to be the victim, of course, as it would be. And I feel like someone needs to actually look at the NCR side of the story and actually see whether or not they deserved it. I know this idea is going to bother some people, and that no child deserves to die for the sins of their fathers, but unfortunately during war that's what happens, and this is essentially what was happening here. It was a war. Well, to start this off, we're going to talk to the man himself and get his side of the story, as you usually do. Big Daddy Con. Better ingredients, better jet, Papa Con.
So the cub enters the wolf's den. What do you want, cub?
Can you tell me about your people?
You want to hear the story of the great Khans? It's a long one, full of honor, glory, and betrayal. We have suffered, but we will regain our glory.
Maybe you could give me the short version.
In a hurry, are you? Very well, then. The great Khans came east, out of the NCR 14 years ago. We ruled the wastes then, and called no man master. But we underestimated the families of the Strip, and they drove us back to Bitter Springs, where we remained until the NCR arrived and drove us here.
What happened to Bitter Springs?
When the NCR came to the Mojave, we thought they would be easy pickings. We raided their caravans, their towns, their camps. They couldn't stop us. At least that's what we thought. They tracked us to Bitter Springs and surrounded us. When our children, our sick and old, fled through a nearby pass, the NCR gunned them down.
Doesn't sound like something the NCR would order.
Oh, they claimed it was a miscommunication, but tell that to those who saw our families butchered. Tell it to the survivors who were banished here.
Alright, there's a lot to unpack here. So the first thing he says is, when the NCR came to the Mojave, which was 7 years ago, we thought they would be easy pickings. We raided their caravans, their towns, their camps. They couldn't stop us. So they came to the Mojave 7 years ago, and Bitter Springs happened 3 years ago. So they were raiding their towns and caravans in the first 4 years. And I'm assuming they weren't very well set up back then, if they had anything established at all, really. And as you can see in every example in New Vegas, whenever a caravan gets raided, they don't exactly leave anything behind. They kind of just take and kill everybody. They don't just take the stuff in the caravan, they kind of kill everybody as well. And I don't think people quite understand how detrimental it is to not get a water caravan when you're in the middle of the fucking desert. A whole town could just get wiped out by missing 1 or 2 caravans. So essentially the Khans were just wiping out caravans and completely destroying anything that the NCR had set up in the early days of the Mojave campaign. They were just murdering random caravaneers, caravan guards, and probably just wiping out entire towns and camps because they could. But no one seems to bring that up when they're talking about what happened to Bitter Springs. No one seems to mention the innocent caravan guards, or the innocent people who were trying to establish towns in the middle of the desert, or the soldiers who were just trying to set up bases that died to the Khans' hands. They only ever talk about the Khans for some reason. This seems awfully convenient. Another part of Papa Khan's story that doesn't really deserve sympathy is the fact that he brings up the old and women thing a lot. But these old people are just old raiders who have probably committed dozens and dozens of atrocities. And the women are also just female raiders who have also done the same. Just because you got old or you're a woman doesn't justify you being a piece of shit. And he obviously implies that all of this happened on purpose, and he feels like that the excuse that it was a miscommunication was just a fraud. But we can actually talk to Major Daughtry about this, and he will confirm that there was some poor intel and miscommunication.
Yeah, I was there. I was Captain Daughtry then. That whole situation was a mess and could easily have been avoided with good intel. The major in charge at the time made a bad call. He thought Bitter Springs was full of Great Khan raiders, so we surrounded the place. By the time any of us realized there were civilians down there, women and children, shooting had already started. The major froze up at the news, and we couldn't get another word out of him. I took over and salvaged the situation as best I could. For my effort, I was promoted to major. Not quite the way I'd have wanted it.
So as you can see here, he was just Captain Daughtry at the time, and when his commanding officer froze up at the news that there was women and children there getting gunned down, he was able to salvage the situation best he could, which got him promoted to Major Daughtry. And you could say that this is all fabricated, but just the way that he describes it with such detail, and the fact that, you know, it's just so much to try and make up on the spot. Like, you'd never remember all these details if it wasn't true. And sure, the person who gave the order might have some ill will against the Khans and just wanted them all wiped out. But as you can see from most of the NCR, it was not with evil intent. But the most damning account of the Khans having it coming is from one of the members of 1st Recon, Bitter, who was originally a member of the Khans until the massacre.
I'm Bitter, 1st Recon. You got a reason to talk to me?
Bitter, that's an unusual name.
You trying to start trouble? Or do you really not know where I got that name?
I didn't mean to offend you, buddy.
It's a Khan name. You know, the great Khans. That's what my parents were. I figured I grew up around the bastards. They owed me a name after all they put me through.
What happened to your parents?
They're dead. Got themselves killed at Bitter Springs. Served them right if you ask me.
Tell me about what happened to them at Bitter Springs.
It was a massacre. That's what a lot of NCR folk will tell you. Most of them feel plenty bad about what happened. But I was there. Saw it myself. I don't care what anybody says. The Khans asked for Bitter Springs. They wouldn't leave the NCR be. My damn parents, too. They were just as bad as the rest.
You don't really mean that, do you?
Don't I? Mister, you never met my parents. My dad, he got himself fucked up every chance he got. Always started with folk for no reason. Hell, he was the one who taught me to shoot. You know how? By taking pot shots at NCR, and not just soldiers. Civilians, too. Even kids. Then he'd get high with his buddies and swap tales about the folk they killed. Bunch of animals. And my mom? A couple of times she tried to sell me to some waster just to score some jet. Even the other Khans said she was useless. Only reason they kept her around was because she was a... how'd my dad say it? A smoking piece of ass.
I think the most damning thing he says here is that they used to take pot shots at NCR women and children. This kind of just shows how sadistic and cruel the Khans really were. And that's the side that no one ever tells you about. People are always talking about how their women and children got murdered at Bitter Springs. What about the ones that were randomly getting shot at? Just living their life in the NCR. Just getting picked off for no reason, just for existing. No one ever seems to talk about them. You can only kick a dog so many times before it bites you, or in this case, a bear.
Guess I could tell a pretty good story if I had a mind. But the truth is, I don't know. Just got lucky. They brought me to Daughtry after the battle. He was just a captain back then. Guess he saw something in me. Knew I didn't belong with the Khans. Maybe he felt bad, too. About how his men killed my folks. I told him he did me a service, but he didn't believe me. Still doesn't. He's a good man, Daughtry. Doesn't act like it sometimes, I know. But he didn't have to take me in.
You're not telling me something. You couldn't have forgotten the whole massacre.
It's like I tell Major Daughtry. Best not to look under a rock if you don't really want to know what's there. Could be that NCR found some blood on me and none of it mine. Could be that a few of those Khans didn't die from NCR bullets. I had scores of my own to settle. Deeper ones than NCR ever had. Don't bother asking who they were with.
As you can see, there's even some animosity among the Khans themselves because they treat each other pretty poorly. I think the final nail in the coffin here is when you ask him what he can tell you about the great Khans, though.
They're scum. Lazy, trumped-up raiders. Most of the time they're drunk or high, and when they're not shooting chems, they're selling them. Used to have a settlement up at Bitter Springs till they pissed off NCR and got slaughtered for their trouble. A lot of us got killed at Bitter Springs. A lot of them, I mean. My parents died too. You're sorry? Well, that makes one of us. Bitter Springs was the best thing that ever happened to me. Best thing that ever happened to my parents, too. They were as bad as the rest. Worse, maybe. You're not fully grown till you've taken a beat down. Everybody gathers around and hits you till you're damn near dead. After that, if you haven't begged for mercy, you get to choose a new name. One you'll use for the rest of your life. When NCR slaughtered the cons of Bitter Springs, I hadn't got my beat down yet. I was still too young. The way I see it, Bitter Springs was my beat down. So afterward, I gave myself a name. It's all I got from the cons. It's all I ever want.
You could say that he just says this stuff to cope with the loss of his parents, but you can tell that this stuff comes from a real place. Just the amount of detail and just the amount of hate when he tells it to you. Pretty real. And we can also confirm that they beat the shit out of their young members until they're near death when we go talk to Jerry the Punk inside Red Rock Canyon. We can also confirm the initiation ritual. If we go to Red Rock Canyon and talk to Jerry the Punk, he tells us that they beat you until you're near death, and if you survive, then you make it into the cons. And as you can see, the cons don't really care about their own young, let alone anybody else's. But they'll still complain about the fact that their children were killed by NCR. Even though they don't really care themselves. But I mean, you want to try and get sympathy wherever you can, right? It makes sense.
I can tell you they're a bunch of big dumb jerks with no appreciation for art. I mean, can you believe their initiation? Everybody has to do it. Well, everybody who wants to be a con anyways. They toss you into the ring there and beat on you for a solid minute. If you survive, you're in. Sure, maybe not if you're some hulking reprobate like Regis or big to the gills like Jack. I've tried 5 times and still haven't made it.
Yeah, that's gonna do it really. I guess you guys want to know the answer to the question, did the great cons deserve it? That's a pretty heavy question, but I feel like they did. They were a little bit too cocky and didn't really think about their actions when they were just killing and raiding innocent people. Did the children deserve it? No. No child deserves to die this way. No child deserves to be murdered for the sins of their fathers. But unfortunately, their fathers weren't really thinking of the repercussions of their actions, and you can only poke a bear so many times before it decides to fuck you up. And unfortunately, that's what the NCR did. Most of the NCR soldiers have no ill will against the cons and didn't really want it to be this way. If you've done Boone's companion quest, you can see that he's basically just trying to cope with the fact that it happened this way. But that's just how it goes. But yeah, that's gonna do it. Hope you guys enjoyed. This is a pretty hefty video. Put a decent amount of work into it. Hope you guys enjoyed. And have a good one.